Hello. Hi, Enza, Yona, Diman. So good to see you guys. Yay. Good morning. Oh. Who's tired? I'm tired. Good morning, Alex. Good morning. Wow, there's 5 people who typed in the chat, and now there's only 4 people tuned in. Who left? Huh? Hey, Sarah. That makes 6 people in the chat and only 5 people tuned in, which is a little weird. I'm going to brew a pot of tea so we can start our discussion. All right, so before we begin, I'd like for us during this session at least, what I really want to get out of it is like a pretty good understanding and context of like where these works kind of fit in the whole history of Western philosophy, and also to answer any questions, because I know for the parts that aren't written like actual dialogues, I know they can get quite boring. And it's easy to kind of just skip over something. So I want to make sure that if you were one of those who kind of read quickly and skimmed over those parts, like just to kind of go over some important bits that you might have missed, right? So that being said, let's get out our notes. I hope you have your notes out, whether they're on Google Notes like Sarah does or like your written notes, okay? And also to look just back on the passages of the reading. And I want everyone just to take sorry about that, awkward. I want you to take 2 to 3 minutes to find your favorite passage from the reading, either from Plato's Socrates' Apologia or Euthyphro. Okay, so either one, like a particular passage that you found interesting, a passage that maybe after you read it, you're like, oh, like this does, like, I do understand this. So it doesn't have to be necessarily complicated, right? You don't have to be like, oh, I found this to be the most interesting. Yeah. Just anything. If anything that you thought was interesting, anything that maybe it was one of the few things you understood, and you just kind of want to share it out, that's cool too, right? So just take the next 2 to 3 minutes to find a passage. Make sure it's only 2 to 3 sentences. Like, well, whatever you copy and paste, make sure it's only 2 and 3 sentences, right? Because we don't want to overload the chat. And I want us to, and then, tell us like what it's from, where in the reading it is, especially if you're taking it from the Apologia. And then I would really want like, oh, it's like near the middle, or it's like during this part of the trial, so we can all like get to it, and have that ready to type out, and like maybe in a separate Google Doc, just have it copied and pasted, ready to go. because what I want to do is I just want to ask each of you which passage each of you to submit it one by one, and we can kind of start the discussion from there. Maybe I'll do this too. Excuse me. I have my passage ready. And good morning, Jacqueline. Oh, okay. Well, let me see, and let me try and copy and paste what I want to say. Oh. All right. So basically, okay. So I will here. I'm gonna post a thing. This is from the early part of the Apologia, and it's in Socrates' defense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the end of the 6th paragraph and the very beginning of the 7th paragraph. And this is part of what I would consider to be a kind of a prelude to the dialogues, right? I feel like um, a lot of Plato's dialogues are written in a kind of format where you have a dialogue, but before the dialogue even occurs, you have like this like pretty lengthy exposition where, you know, this is kind of like flexing. So here's the flex, okay? And Socrates is describing a visit to the oracle at Delphi, where he asked the oracle to tell him whether there was anyone wiser than I was. And the Pythian prophetess answered that, no, there is no man wiser than you, Socrates. Uh, and then he continues on to say, why do I mention this? Because I'm going to explain to you why I have such an evil name, right? So I think um, a little bit of context to give about this is, right, so Socrates, as mentioned, like earlier in the Apology, was not a philosopher in the traditional sense that we know, right? Like, yes, he is an academic. No, he did not write books. No, he didn't necessarily charge his students like in a traditional sense. So he didn't like have a lot of tutees, for instance, right? And most of his philosophizing was just done like in everyday agoras or on the street where he would just ask people questions, right? And engage in conversations with people. And he was so well known that what ended up happening was that these public conversations he would have with a lot of people eventually drew large crowds. And this is what was known as like what's known today as like the Socratic school, right? Where like his school was quite informal. He didn't charge tuition, right? Most people just like kind of just like watched these conversations. And yeah, so he why am I saying this? Because most of what we know is from Plato himself writing about Socrates in these dialogues. And these dialogues are still today considered to be works of fiction, where Socrates himself is like a character talking with like real people. Like Euthyphro was a real person, but like, did he really say these things that he did with Socrates in the dialogue? Probably not, right? So these dialogues, I feel like, are meant to teach us about the philosophy of Socrates, and the philosophy itself is real, and the spirit of the conversation is real, but the conversation itself is probably not real, right? So in reading these dialogues, and you have to know that most of Socrates' disciples wrote dialogues, but only Plato's are the ones that have really survived. Um, so I think that's like really cool, right? And in doing so, you have to like kind of dissect or like divorce like what's fake, what's fiction, and what's real, and like what are the real lessons that we're meant to be learning from these dialogues. Okay, so in doing so, he writes this, right? He asked the oracle to tell him whether there was anyone wiser than I was, and the Pythian prophetess answered that there was no man wiser. Very subtle flex, right? Or not so subtle. If you're trying to establish like your own character and like why you are wise, and you do so by invoking like this fictional recounting of you visiting a prophet asking who's the wisest man, or is there no man wiser than I am, and then like her like confirming there is, um that I think has to be taken with like with the fact in mind that Socrates himself doesn't view himself as a wise man. So that statement was like added in the dialogue in order to produce a kind of Socratic irony, right? In that there is this belief, Socrates had this own belief that he is not wise, and he visits a prophet that tells him that there is no man wiser. And he resolves this struggle. He resolves that dichotomy by exploring like his own thinking. So first he examines like why he doesn't consider himself wise, and then he later combines that uh, and makes it helps make it make sense with the whole other thing, which would be to say um, he is the only man that is aware of what he does not know. He is the only man who is wise to the fact that he is unwise, and that by itself makes him the wisest. Yes, and you have to remember that this is a kind of character, right? Like Plato is an incredibly talented dramatist and a playwright in his own right, right? He's just as good of a dramatist as he is as a philosopher. And his characterizations of Socrates seem so real and lifelike that many who read them end up hating Socrates or loving Socrates because he becomes so lifelike in this way. Um, yeah, the reason why I chose that passage is I think it's so funny, it's arrogant, and um, the way he ties it in, right? The way he makes it make sense, right? Because he, I just think it's so cute the way he frames his argument. It's like, well, like this whole thing is just about him saying like, oh, but I'm not wise. I believe myself to be not wise. Like, but there's this person that says I'm super wise, and he's like using that whole clash of ideas or this irony in that like he says he's not wise and that there's this other person that says he is wise to really, well, what is he really doing? He's essentially like saying that he is wise, right? By like posing this fake argument between like, oh, someone says I am not wise and someone says I am. Like he's just basically using that to say that he is. But more importantly, I think he uses it to espouse a personal philosophy of his, which I think is important, and it's like humility, right? And I think um, while he does kind of flex to say that he is the only person that realizes that he is not wise, and in doing so has a special wisdom, do I think that's true? Does he think that's true? No. Of course, he's not the only person who recognizes what he does not know, right? Many many people stumble upon that wisdom, whether in their teenage years or their 20s or their 30s, right? You quickly, if you think critically, right, you quickly come to the realization of all that it is that you do not know, right? But what he is in sense, but what he is in a sense doing, right, is he is kind of glorifying that way of thinking, right? And he's saying like, oh, I am the wisest because I know how wise I am not. By saying that, he's essentially like glorifying that way of thinking and kind of elevating it and saying like that is the way to be and that is the way to live. Anyways, that was a long, uh, that lasted a lot longer than I thought. Yona, if you're still there, could you tell us your favorite passage or a passage that stuck out to you? Sarah says he always seems to be talking down to people. That is true. And I think in a real sense he did. Um, the one thing that we can take away while Yona types down, or Yona, and if Yona's not there, Enza, right? Yona and Enza, if you could type the passage that you'd like to share. And while you do that, I'll answer Sarah's question, right? So he seems to always be talking, that is true. And if there's one thing that we can take away from these dialogues, like while they're not true, the dialogues, in addition to like other historical texts about Socrates, seem to heavily like suggest that this is exactly like the way he did talk. So like maybe like these conversations weren't exactly like the ones that he had, right? But like his manner of speaking and questioning are still like the exact same, right? So he catches people in traps like he does for Meletius, and when he asks Euthyphro, right? Like he presses him for like 4 different definitions of piety, right? When Euthyphro asks him like, like blah blah blah, like you think that is a good, do you think that is pious, right? Or like, of course it is pious to persecute your own father in like this specific case. Immediately, instead of arguing with him, Socrates just straight up asks him, but what is pious? What is piety? Define piety, right? And like that line of questioning, I think, is what annoyed other people about him, right? And brought them to persecute him. All right, so Enza says, I will split mine up so it fits the 200. She says, and what do you say of piety, Euthyphro? Is not piety, according to your definition, loved by all the gods? Yes, Socrates, because it is pious or holy or for some other reason. No, that it is the reason. It is loved because it is holy, not holy because it is loved. Yes, Socrates. And that by which is dear to the gods is loved by them and is in a state to be loved by them. Okay. So Yona, wow. So Yona and Enza basically have come up with the first. They both reference the same part, right? Which so what's going on? Socrates asks Euthyphro to offer a definition of piety, and Euthyphro's first definition is to say like, oh, what I'm doing now is pious, right? Prosecuting my own father for manslaughter, right? And then Socrates rejects that definition because it's not a definition, it's an example, right? So then Euthyphro's second definition is what Piety is anything that pleases the gods. And Socrates in this dialogue praises this definition, right, by saying like, hey, it's more general and it's an actual definition rather than an example. So props to you. But in a way, how does he reject this again? Oh, because he says that different gods like different things, and gods have arguments all the time. So you can't define what is pious by what gods like or what pleases the gods, because that differs from god to god, right? So then he presses Euthyphro even further, and he arrives at this definition. What all gods love is pious, and what all gods hate is impious. And I think this is what Enza and Yona are kind of referencing, right? It's Socrates' critique of this third definition. How would you show that what all gods absolutely agree in approving this act? Prove to me that they do, and I will applaud your wisdom as long as they live. Yes, Itamar is now quoting a passage from Socrates' critique of the second definition, right? And now we are going to critique the third definition, which I think is like the most philosophizing that we like kind of run into here, because he presents this argument. Like, why does he say this is wrong? Why does he say this is wrong? There's a contradiction, right? Because he says, one, like things that are pious should be intrinsically pious, right? Like they are pious because they are pious. Like there is nothing extrinsic about these acts, right? Like it should be a self-evident fact that they are pious, right? But if you define piety by something that all gods like, right? Then you run into a contradiction, right? These two statements are incompatible. Because if you're loved by a god, then that means it's it's a passive state of being, right? And your state of being is dependent on what a god does to you, right? And he uses like the carried analogy, like to be carried. Like you are only carried if you are being carried by something else, right? So by this definition, by Euthyphro's definition, like you're only pious if you are loved by another god, right? So that in itself runs by a contradiction, because you're dependent on an action from an external body or an agent, and it's no longer intrinsic. And I think this is like a really great argument, and I'm curious to see if you guys disagree, because a lot of Socrates' arguments are kind of like gotcha-isms and semantic traps. What's an example? Like in his defense, in his Apologia to Meletius, he says, do not bad neighbors do bad things to their neighbors. To which Meletius says, of course, right? And that's why we don't like bad people. And then, then Socrates would say, like, well, why would I desire that? Like, why would I corrupt the youth if that would mean that they would become bad neighbors and then do bad things to me? Like, why would I want bad things to happen to me? And it's kind of like a gotchaism, and it's not a real sound argument, right? I don't think that's a valid argument at all, because it takes into the premise that Socrates doesn't, it takes like a really simplistic notion that like corrupting youth creates bad people, and that would be his only motivation, right? It doesn't take into account other motivations for corrupting youth, right? I think the principal gotchaism, the principal semantic trap in the Apology, I think, goes into. Oh, it's so long. I just have to find it. Oh, the improver argument. I think that was a pretty good one. Oh no, here's a good one. Um, it's like Meletus. Um, are you someone who has thought about the improvement of youth? And then Meletus says yes, right? And then Socrates asks, well, like who improves the youth, right? Um, he implies that if just like there is a horse watcher, a watchmaker, blah blah blah, like there needs to be an improver of youth. If you are to even study of, if you're going to study the improvement of youth, you are essentially studying like who improves the youth, right? And then he says he gets Meletus to say that everyone is an improver of youth, whether it's a judge or a senator or even Athenian citizens. And but he says, but except me, right? Like I am the only bad one who doesn't improve the youth. And Meletus says, yes, of course. Uh, Sorry, we're just not going to go over that. It's like a really long argument. It also acts as if everyone acts rationally. Yeah, right. So it's taking into a lot of things. It's taking a lot of things into account. Um, yeah. Do not bad neighbors do bad things to their neighbors. Yes. Right. Gallagher, Dimon, or Sarah, do you have a passage you would like to discuss? Euthyphro gives a very autocratic belief of the gods, that they are not inherently moral, but can dictate what is pious based on their own faculties. That is an autocratic religion. Yes, yes. I definitely agree. And if you take into like what's like being said here about to be like a rough picture of Socrates' own criticism of Athenian gods, then you can kind of see like where the charges of him corrupting the youth come from, right? Because the principal charge that was laid against him was that he was basically refuting the Athenian gods, right? And like kind of introducing like his own and refuting their authority. And this is like a really classic way of viewing that. 1 second, I accidentally deleted it. Sorry, no problem, Sarah. Sorry if I seem a bit absent-minded. I read this a long time ago, and I don't have my notes. I should have taken notes with you. This was I severely overestimated my ability to remember all of this and the important points. So the next readings, I will definitely read it with you. Right? If I expect you to take the time to read it, then I gotta put in that time too, and I'll take my own notes, and we'll be Gucci. Well, better notes. I did take really rough outlines of what I wanted to talk about, but that's not enough. This I thought was a particularly interesting passage. While Sarah brings that up. Oh, okay. I gotta divide it in half too. Yikes. Okay. All right. So here it is. This sign I have had ever since I was a child. The sign is a voice which comes to me and always forbids me to do something which I am going to do, but never commands me to do anything. And this is what stands in the way of my being a politician. So this is soccer, and you have to note that this is like a really funny way of looking at Socrates. And we'll get to Sarah's a bit in a bit. For this fear, yeah. So we'll go there later. Uh, I want to kind of talk about what I find really funny about Socrates, or the way Plato presents Socrates here, and it's that he's basically arguing with himself to make himself look better in this characterization, right? And he's like, and because he's not really debating anyone, right? Like he kind of has a mini dialogue with Meletus, but in reality, like most of his arguments are like him like presenting like a hypothetical person that says, "But what about this?" And then he'll like counter like that hypothetical person that he has just himself presented. Did you guys notice that? Because what the passage I just what I just typed up, it's in a place where Socrates is saying like, oh, and for those people who say, but if you are so wise, like why do you not go into politics? And then he offers this in response to like why he hasn't entered a life of politics, right? Um, and I think in a similar vein, he asks, like right before this, he was talking about it's like, why do you pursue this way of life if it doesn't bring you money and it's like it's dangerous? And then he starts talking about like, well, um, like those who like live life to avoid death like are very unwise and blah blah blah. You know, I think it's like so funny how he kind of like presents the ideas in this manner, or how Plato probably describes it. But I think this is a really interesting thing because even though this is fictional and even though it's like kind of funny and like kind of absurd, like the way he's presenting these arguments, there is real wisdom uh, to be taken away from this quote, right? This sign I have ever had since I was a child. The sign is a voice which comes to me and which always forbids me to do something which I'm going to do, but never commands me to do anything. So, what is this really saying? It's saying that his philosophy, like Socrates' own philosophy, the one thing that it is really good at is identifying bad things and identifying things that you are not supposed to do. But the one thing that it is bad at is identifying good things and telling you how to live your life. All it does is tell you how not to live your life. And you see this most clearly in Euthyphro, right? At the end, they are unable to come up with a definition of piety, even though they could probably give you example upon example upon example of impious things, right? They are unable to come up with a working definition of piety. And that brings it to full circle because he's about to go on trial for impiety, right? So it's like he's left with this dilemma. And I think that there's a real poetic irony in there. But I think that's really cool. Now let's go back to Sarah's quote. For this fear of death is indeed the pretense. Sarah is talking about the very thing I was talking about before, right? When he's like talking about this, like, why do you not fear death, Socrates? And he's like saying that, right? He's like air quoting some random hater. And he's like, and my haters would say, do you not fear death? Like, well, nah. Like, is it not wise to? And to that I would say, for this fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom, and not real wisdom, being the appearance of knowing the unknown, since no one knows whether death, which they in their fear apprehend to be the greatest evil, may not be the greatest good. Right. So Sarah, why did you choose this? And if anyone else in the chat wants to add on to like um, why they thought this particular passage was good, what it was trying to say, how it's connected to my passage, go ahead. All right. But yeah, I am curious to why you chose that, Sarah. What is this really trying to say? if you're struggling, you can read that passage again and look at his principal argument his principal argument behind trying to justify like why seeking to survive is unwise. Um, because he cites his own experience as a soldier as like the principal example of why always seeking to live or survive is unwise or impious in a way. Enza says, this to me seems like it could be again about death, that ending someone's life might be perceived to be the greatest evil, when in reality no one knows what death. Yeah, so it's kind of, I mean, so much I feel like 80% of philosophy is centered around death because it's like the one unanswered question that like fascinates and captivates all of our imaginations and our terror and our dread, right? The Greeks are no exception. Sarah, because he's saying people are scared of the evils that come with death. No one knows about death, so to be scared of it is to pretend to know it. Oh. Yona hidden spin facts. I think he gives an example how in death, maybe he can speak to Greek writers like Homer and engage in Socratic discussion with them, which would be a good thing in death. He also references experiencing pure nothing, like pure nothingness, like a dreamless sleep, tossing and turnless sleep, a sleep without any sensation would actually be a blissful escape from the mortal world. So he talks about it in a lot of ways. He talks about death being desirable in two different ways. But then he says that no one knows what comes after death. So why would you fear something that you have no idea is going to happen? Yes. To which more modern philosophers would say that's exactly why we fear it, because we don't know. If to that, wouldn't you argue? Would you not ask this question to Socrates? If there are two doors, and behind one door is your loving wife and family, and behind the other door is someone who wants to kill you, and you don't know who lies behind which door, and you would be forced to open a door and walk in a room, would you not be scared because you do not know what lies beyond the door? Right? But I want to go back to his original argument of why this is kind of connected to his own personal philosophy, right? He says, right, because the thing I posted was saying what? That I only know what is bad and what should be avoided, and I do not know what should be pursued, right? And I think that's true with a lot of philosophy. And I think his example with death is illustrates that really well. So, for example, let me repeat myself. He says that he's good at identifying what should be avoided and bad at identifying what should be pursued. So what are we supposed to avoid now? We are supposed to avoid fearing death. And he is bad at giving you a reason for wanting death, right? And to avoid death, to his argument that he gives to avoid avoiding death is his own personal experience as a soldier. He asks of his time as a soldier, should I have cowered? Should I have stayed at the line and not charged at my enemy when my commanding officer told me to do so? That would be unvirtuous. No? Yes. So he's giving you one example where it would be virtuous to accept your own death and to not fear dying. Because if you feared to death, then that would make you a bad soldier, right? So again, he's giving a specific example, and he's giving you a really clear thing, an example of what to avoid, right? You should avoid being a coward. You should avoid like fearing death. But But this kind of philosophy and reasoning is like really bad at identifying like what you should do, right? Like so, but it doesn't give like a really good reason for wanting to die, right? It only gives you a good reason for not for avoiding death, right? Yeah. It is the possibility for evil that's because it's unknown, Sarah, right? The possibility that the thing after death could be bad is reason enough to fear it, right? If you knew that it was bad, maybe in some way you could prepare for it, right? But the fact that you don't know what happens after you die, and that it could be one type of bad, and another type of bad, and another type of bad, or even some good, or even some nothing, it's that very unknown that's terrifying to so many people, right? He's saying that we shouldn't fear death. And this is also what he says right before he dies, right before he drinks hemlock. Whoa, 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 Yona. Calm down here. Like, isn't it human nature to fear the unknown? We can't control what happens after we die. I don't know, Yona. That's a really strong premise you're making. Do you think every human feels this way? Define. I'm going to be a little Socratic to you, Yona, and say, define human nature. And in addition to that question, I would also ask, what's the point in invoking an idea of human nature? What are you trying to say? What are you trying to argue when you invoke human nature in quotes? Like, what's that supposed to do to your argument? Yes, he doesn't fear death. Well, that's what he said. That's what Plato says. Socrates even says. Who knows what Socrates really believed right before he drank the cup of hemlock? Maybe he was putting on a brave face. Maybe what he was really trying to do was inspire his students, right? Because he essentially did become a martyr after this. And just look at the the popularity of Plato's dialogues. Like they still survive to this day, right? Like that's incredible, right? Plato lived; he died in 350 BCE. Like, and we're still reading his dialogues. It's ridiculous, right? Um, yeah, Socrates ended up being martyred and glorified, and in a way, I think it shows like a really beautiful aspect of ancient Greek society, in that they are able to look at their past faults and say like, "Oh, we did something wrong." And Socrates actually had a lot to contribute and a lot to offer, and we probably shouldn't have killed him, right? You see that with modern day Germany, where every student through the public education system is like ingrained with like this collective national shame of the atrocities committed by the National Socialist Party during World War II. Like every German is like indoctrinated with like this like deep national shame of what they did. And that's something I guess they share with the ancient Greeks. It's something this country is utterly incapable of. Uh, the way people think, the way they are inclined to think, I would say. It's always a generalization. The term human nature tries to organize human behavior to common experiences. But why, Yona? Why do we even do this? Do you use it to I feel like what I'm trying to get at is when most people invoke an idea of human nature, they do so with the intention of justifying or explaining behavior. It's like, why do people do this? Oh, human nature. And I think going deeper than human nature is necessary, right? Yeah, we're predisposed to do this, but Don't you think that's a boring line of inquiry? Right? Instead of looking at a rational reason behind like why we do things and blah blah blah, right? Um, for example, I spent a good three, 3.5 years of my mid 20s examining why people love. Like, what's the point of romantic love, right? Um, and that was a really interesting course of study for me. How boring would it have been for me just to say, "Oh, it's human nature to want someone. It's human nature to just want to be desired," and just end it that way? No, 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 right? You want to really, for a deeper understanding of human behavior and motivation, you want to really start looking at logos, right? And like really dive a little deeper into like how people think and the rationale, right? You want to construct an argument, right? So that's like the practice of philosophy, right? You are constructing an argument for uh, doing a certain way. And to reference something like and the other thing about human nature is like it's like such an intangible and immutable substance that's incredibly hard to prove. Like, wouldn't it be incredibly hard to prove that everyone thinks the same way and everyone is inclined to feel a certain way? Because you're the only consciousness you're really sure of is yourself, right? I really have no idea or no proof that Yona, that you and I share the same basic, like natural human desires, right? Like, I don't know that you do, right? Yeah, and it's psychology, and it's weak. It's a weak science, right? And you can't really base a philosophical argument. Well, okay, there is a branch of modern, like 21st century empirical philosophy that kind of combines psychology and philosophy, but it's definitely not analytic. And we are looking at an introduction to analytic philosophy, right? So we want to avoid psychology. It is an inference based on our observations. But again, it's not like a sound. Do you know what I mean, Yona? Like, it's really difficult to make. It's easy to make a valid argument, but incredibly difficult to make a sound argument based on human psychology, because the premises are so hard to prove. Human nature. What is that? How do you prove that something is human nature? Yes, 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 yes. Thanks. I'm not attacking you, Yona. You know, you just got me a little heated. Uh, Enza, how do you pronounce your last name again? It's Jonas Guinea or Jonas Guini? I totally forgot. I feel really bad. Um, I shouldn't have even asked on the stream. I could have just looked at your comment from the other thing. Cool. So I did. Um, Squeegee? Don't answer. I'll look on the thread. I'll look on the comment thread for the previous assignment. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Guess what? It's all downhill from here. The three videos, if you guys haven't already seen them, are really woo. There's so much more. They're so much more easily. Oh, Junie, yes. Um, why did I say? Yeah, why did I say Yona Squeegee? Uh, Yona Squeegee. You should. I would say roll with it. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. The videos that are remaining, super easy to watch, really accessible. Professor Myers really breaks it down in a way that I think is pretty cool. Very easily digestible. Uh, and I will post the prompts today, and let's aim to have them done by Friday morning, and go from there. All right? Cool. Thanks for tuning in. I know today was a bit more rambly. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, the next one will be better. I promise. Okay? And I'll see you in a bit. Okay? Oh no, I felt very disorganized today. Some things, it's not the weather because it's real sunny. I could blame it on the foggy weather, but it's not foggy, but we'll see. Okay, my AP students, I'll see you in 5 minutes, okay? And uh, my philosophy homies, I'll see you Thursday morning, and where we can discuss the videos, where we can kind of bounce some ideas off for the discussion prompts if you guys are still working on those, and yeah, we'll go from there. Have a great day.